This is the story of the surrender Bettys and the P-38 pilots who almost didn't make it home. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radio for the first time in history. Japan had surrendered. But surrendering and actually ending a war are two completely different things. Japan's military was scattered across the Pacific, thousands of islands, millions of soldiers. And not all of them had radios. Not all of them had gotten the message. Some didn't believe it. Some refused to accept it. The Allies faced an impossible problem. How do you coordinate the surrender of an empire when you're still technically at war, when any Japanese plane in the sky could be shot down on sight? The answer became the most dangerous diplomatic mission in history. The mission fell to the 49th Fighter Group, one of the most decorated American fighter units in the Pacific. They had been fighting since 1942. Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, Okinawa. By August 1945, the 49th was flying P-38 Lightnings out of Lashima, a tiny island just off Okinawa, barely 3 miles long. Lashima had been taken from the Japanese in April 1945 after brutal fighting. War correspondent Ernie Pyle had been killed there by Japanese machine gun fire. Now 4 months later, it was an American airbase, and it was about to become neutral ground for surrender negotiations. The 9th Fighter Squadron, part of the 49th Fighter Group, would fly escort. The P-38 Lightning was the perfect plane for this mission. Twin-engine, long-range, fast, heavily armed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon, but most importantly, distinctive. There was no other plane in the sky that looked like a P-38. Twin booms, central nacelle, unmistakable silhouette. That meant Japanese pilots wouldn't mistake them for enemy aircraft, and American anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't accidentally shoot them down. Because in August 1945, that was a very real danger. August 19, 1945. 4 days after the surrender announcement, pilots from the 9th Fighter Squadron were briefed on a mission unlike anything they had flown before. They were going to escort Japanese bombers. Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, the same type that had been attacking American forces for 4 years. But these Bettys would be painted white, with bright green crosses instead of the red rising sun. They would be carrying Japanese surrender envoys to meet American commanders on Lashima. And the P-38s would make sure they got there alive. The briefing officer was clear. Anyone shoots at these planes and you could restart the war. The plan was carefully coordinated through neutral Switzerland. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers would fly from Kisarazu Airfield near Tokyo to Lashima, Okinawa. They would be painted completely white, the international color of truce, with bright green crosses on the wings and fuselage instead of the red rising sun. Inside, 16 Japanese officers, led by Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Vice Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. Their mission? Receive surrender instructions from General Douglas MacArthur's staff, arrange logistics for the formal surrender ceremony, and guarantee safe passage for MacArthur's landing in Japan. But there was a massive problem. Not every Japanese unit had accepted the surrender. On August 15th, a group of young Imperial Japanese Army officers had attempted a coup to prevent the surrender broadcast. They stormed the Imperial Palace, killed several guards, and tried to find the recording of Hirohito's surrender speech to destroy it. They failed, but it showed how fragile the peace was. And in the skies over Japan, some fighter pilots were still flying combat patrols. Some hadn't heard the surrender order. Others refused to believe it. If one of them saw American fighters approaching Japan, they might attack. If they saw Japanese bombers being escorted by American fighters, they might think the bombers were captured and try to shoot them down. The margin for error was 0. August 19, 1945. Morning. The 2 white Bettys took off from Kisarazu Airfield near Tokyo. Radio call sign Baton 1 and Baton 2. Named after the American defeat in 1942, a deliberate choice by the Japanese to show acknowledgement of their surrender. They flew south at 10,000 feet, completely unarmed, utterly defenseless. American B-25. Mitchell bombers from the 345th Bombardment Group provided initial escort from Japan toward the rendezvous point. Then the P-38s took over. 12 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings from the 9th Fighter Squadron, 49th Fighter Group, lifted off from Lashima. They rendezvoused with the White Betties over the East China Sea. One pilot later described the moment. "We'd been trying to shoot down Betties for 3 years. Now we were protecting them. It was the strangest feeling of the war." The P-38s flew in a protective box formation, 4 fighters above at 15,000 feet, high cover, 4 on the flanks at 12,000 feet, lateral protection, 4 below at 8,000 feet, low cover. Any unidentified aircraft approaching the Betties would be intercepted immediately. The flight took nearly 3 hours. As they approached Lashima, American anti-aircraft gunners, who had spent years shooting at Japanese planes, were given explicit orders. Hold fire. White planes with green crosses are friendly. Spotters confirmed the aircraft. The guns stayed silent. The 2 White Betties landed safely on Lashima at 2:30 p.m., August 19, 1945. Japanese officers stepped out onto American-controlled territory for the first time since the surrender. They were met by American commanders who, just days before, had been planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. An operation estimated to cost 1 million Allied casualties and potentially kill tens of millions of Japanese. Now, they were negotiating peace. For 2 days, August 19th and 20th, Japanese and American officers worked out the critical details. Where would MacArthur land? Atsugi Airfield, 25 miles southwest of Tokyo. When? August 30th. How would American forces be guaranteed safe passage? The Japanese agreed to disarm all kamikaze units within 50 miles of Atsugi, remove propellers from all remaining aircraft in the area, post military police guards at the airfield to prevent rogue attacks, paint all operational fighters with green surrender crosses, provide Japanese interpreters and liaison officers. But there was still a problem. Some Japanese military units refused to obey the surrender order. On August 18th, the 302nd Naval Air Group, an elite fighter squadron near Tokyo, had fired on American B-32 reconnaissance planes despite the ceasefire. 1 American gunner was killed. On August 22nd, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of kamikaze forces, would lead a final unauthorized suicide attack against Okinawa with 11 aircraft. None returned. The Americans couldn't be certain that every Japanese pilot had received or would obey the stand-down order. The return flight would be even more dangerous. August 20th, 1945. Late afternoon. The 2 White Betties prepared to return to Japan. This time, they carried American officers. Brigadier General William C. Dunkel and a team of advanced staff, MacArthur's advance party. If these planes were shot down, the peace process could collapse. The invasion of Japan might still happen. Millions could die. The 9th Fighter Squadron was assigned escort duty again. But this time, B-25 Mitchell bombers would accompany the formation for the entire flight back to Japan, both as additional protection and as a show of American air power. The formation, 2 White Betties in the center, flying at 10,000 feet. B-25 Mitchell bombers flanking them at the same altitude. P-38 Lightnings providing high cover at 15,000 feet and low cover at 8,000 feet. The P-38s flying top cover were in the most vulnerable position. If Japanese fighters attacked, they would engage first, buying time for the bombers and transports to escape. The route took them directly over Japanese-controlled waters. Despite the surrender, Japanese naval vessels were still at sea. Submarines, destroyers. Some still had working radar and anti-aircraft guns. If one captain hadn't received the ceasefire order or refused to accept it, he might open fire. As the formation crossed into Japanese airspace, tension peaked. American pilots scanned the horizon constantly, fingers near triggers, eyes tracking every cloud, every shadow. Japanese radar stations tracked the formation. Ground controllers radioed fighter bases. Some Japanese pilots recognized the green crosses and stood down. Others were confused. Why were Japanese bombers being escorted by American fighters? At several air bases, Japanese pilots ran to their planes, unsure whether to scramble or stay grounded. Officers shouted orders, "Stand down!" Those are surrender envoy aircraft. Do not engage. But communication in Japan's fractured command structure was chaotic. One rogue pilot, one unit that hadn't gotten the message. That's all it would take. The formation was 30 minutes from Atsugi when the American pilots received a radio transmission. Unidentified aircraft, bearing 340, range 12 miles, closing fast. Every P-38 pilot's adrenaline spiked. The top cover element broke formation and climbed to intercept position. Guns armed, safety switches off. They were seconds from engaging. And then they identified the contacts. American B-29 superfortresses. Returning from a photographic reconnaissance mission over Tokyo. The B-29 crews hadn't been briefed on the surrender escort flights. They saw P-38s in an aggressive intercept pattern and thought they were under attack. For approximately 30 seconds, American pilots were moments away from firing on other American pilots. The flight leader radioed, "Friendly! Friendly! 9th Fighter Squadron, escorting surrender envoys. Do not engage." The B-29s acknowledged and altered course. Crisis averted by seconds. But it revealed just how fragile the situation was. Even with Japan's official surrender, the fog of war could still turn deadly in an instant. The formation continued to Atsugi. The White Betties landed safely. American officers stepped onto Japanese soil. The P-38s and B-25s circled overhead until the planes were secure on the ground. Then they turned back toward Okinawa. Mission complete. But the danger wasn't over. As the P-38s flew back across the Pacific toward Hiroshima, they were running low on fuel. The P-38 had excellent range for a fighter, over 1,300 miles with drop tanks, but the extended escort mission had pushed them to the limit. Several pilots reported fuel levels below 20%. If they encountered headwinds or had to divert, they might not make it. And then the weather turned. A tropical storm was forming between Japan and Okinawa. Visibility dropped. Turbulence increased. The formation had to climb above the storm to 18,000 feet, burning even more fuel. One P-38 reported an engine problem, oil pressure dropping in the right engine. The pilot had two choices: try to make it back to Hiroshima on one engine or ditch in the ocean and hope for rescue. He chose to continue. The formation stayed with him, reducing speed to conserve his fuel. After what felt like hours, Hiroshima appeared on the horizon. All 12 P-38s landed safely. The pilot with the failing engine touched down with less than 50 gallons remaining, about 10 minutes of flight time. The mechanics inspected his plane and found a fractured oil line. If it had failed completely at altitude, the engine would have seized and he would have gone into the ocean. He made it home by minutes, August 30th, 1945. 10 days after the Surrender Betty escort missions, General Douglas MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield aboard his personal C-54 transport named Baton. He stepped onto Japanese soil wearing sunglasses, an open-collar khaki uniform, and his signature corncob pipe. The advance work done by the Surrender Betty flights had made this moment possible. Atsugi was secured, kamikaze units disarmed, Japanese forces standing down. Thousands of American troops would follow in the coming days. September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japan formally surrendered. World War II was over. The 49th Fighter Group, 9th Fighter Squadron remained in Japan for several months as part of the occupation force. They flew patrol missions, provided air cover for American ground troops, helped map former Japanese military installations. But the war, the real shooting war, was done. The 49th Fighter Group finished World War II as the highest-scoring fighter group in the 5th Air Force. 664 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Over 100 aces produced, including some of America's top pilots. Multiple presidential unit citations, but their final combat-era mission, escorting the surrender Bettys, might have been their most important. It wasn't about shooting down enemy planes, it was about ensuring peace had a chance. One mistake, one rogue Japanese pilot, one trigger-happy American gunner, and the fragile ceasefire could have collapsed. Millions more could have died. But the pilots of the 9th Fighter Squadron got it right. They flew with discipline, restraint, professionalism, and they brought everyone home. The two white Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers that flew the historic surrender missions had remarkable fates. After completing their missions on August 19th and 20th, both aircraft were briefly retained by the Japanese for liaison flights during the early occupation period. By October 1945, both were officially decommissioned and scrapped as part of Japan's mandatory disarmament. For decades, historians believed no trace of them remained. But in 1991, researchers discovered fragments of one surrender Betty in a Japanese aviation museum storage facility. Parts of the fuselage, still bearing traces of white paint and the green cross markings, were recovered and preserved. Today, those fragments are displayed at aviation museums in Japan, a tangible reminder of the moment when enemies became escorts and war became peace. August 19th and 20th, 1945. American P-38 pilots from the 9th Fighter Squadron, 49th Fighter Group, escorted Japanese bombers carrying the men who would end World War II. They didn't fire a shot, but their presence in the sky, their discipline, their professionalism, their restraint, helped end the deadliest conflict in human history. Some of those pilots had been fighting since 1942, 3 years of combat, missions over jungles, oceans, and enemy territory, friends lost, near-death experiences, trauma that would last a lifetime. And then, in 2 days, it was over. The enemy they'd been trying to destroy became the people they were protecting. Many of those pilots lived long lives. They watched the P-38 Lightning go from cutting-edge fighter to museum piece. They saw former enemies become allies, Japan and America, from total war to close partnership. Some lived to attend reunions where American and Japanese veterans shook hands and shared stories. The Surrender Betty missions were a footnote in the larger history of World War II. But for the men who flew them, they represented something profound. The moment when war ended and peace, fragile, uncertain, but real, finally had a chance.